Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on the 5 steps to protect your organization against the ransomware threat. This webinar is brought to you by Veriato RansomSafe, a vital layer in your ransomware defense. My name is Holger Schulze, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. Some of you may know me from the 360,000 member information security community that I manage on LinkedIn. And today we'll discuss the threat of ransomware attacks and what preventative measures you can take in order to stop ransomware in its tracks. We will also talk about what you should do if ransomware has found its way into your IT environment and how to deal with the aftermath of a ransomware attack. Now, before we get started, let's go over a few quick housekeeping items. If you have any questions during the webinar, please submit them using the questions window on your GoToWebinar panel. You can submit questions at any time during the webinar, and we will collect them and answer your questions during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. Finally, this webinar is being recorded, and we will make the recording available to you after the webinar, together with additional materials on ransomware, and more on that at the end of the webinar. Now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, security expert and founder of Techvangelism, Nick Cavalancia. Nick, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Holger. Welcome everybody to the webcast. I'm glad you're here today. I'm going to guess by the fact that you've honored me by joining today's webcast that ransomware is either an existing problem inside of your organization or it's something that you're trying to wrap your head around, perhaps, trying to come up with an effort to come up with a defense plan of some sorts. And if it's the former, of course, hey, sorry to hear that because that puts you in a bad position. But even so, that kind of puts you in the same boat as the latter group I just mentioned. You guys need a plan as well. You're trying to figure out what is the right defense plan. And in my 25 years or so of IT experience, I've consulted with countless organizations over the years, and I've never seen a single security threat that's so rampant and so pervasive, and I think you guys would agree. I'll talk later about just how bad it really is, but I think you agree just with the premise itself. And as you try to layer on defenses, part of the challenge, of course, becomes that every vendor makes the bold claim that they're going to remedy the problem, and yet the problem not only continues, but we're seeing it thrive even today. And so that's a real challenge for us all. So the question becomes, what's the right plan of attack to put proper ransomware protection in place? And so in today's webcast, I'm going to walk through a 5-step approach to build that layered defense strategy. And it's going to put your organization in the best possible position against ransomware. And as in all of my webinars, I want this to be as interactive as possible. So I've got a couple questions planned for you guys, and should you have questions, answers, jokes, anecdotes, whatever it is you feel like sharing, it comes to mind while I'm walking through the presentation, be sure to put those in the Q&A box. I'll try to weave some of those in if I can throughout the presentation. And of course, we're going to take questions and do those at the end of the presentation as well. So I just saw someone said there's no video. Kurt, do you see the video, just to double check? Holger, do you see video? Just double checking. Is someone seeing video while I'm doing this? I want to continue on until I know we've got video.
See if you can share your screen. Click the show screen button if that's not already in place.
Try this one more time and see what happens here.
I can see your screen.
Okay, we'll keep going then. Welcome, glad you're here. Let's jump in, everybody. So let's start with a ransomware State of the Union. Kind of what does it look like today? And this is, first off, I think it's important to kind of get in the right mindset. In 2016, ransomware was considered to be a $1 billion business, and I chose the word business on purpose. And the reason for that is that this is actually a business. This is no longer that like Neo from the Matrix movies or something, where he's sitting at the very beginning of the first Matrix film in his room, with the darkened lights and everything, wearing a hoodie, and it's over his head, and this one guy sort of typing on a keyboard, maliciously at 2 in the morning. It's not like that anymore. This is very much a business. There are companies in some states of the world that are actually building these types of the Trojans. They're building the ransomware. They're building the delivery mechanisms. They're building the mechanisms for taking the money and everything. This is an actual business. And so I want you to think of it that way. According to the FBI, there's over 4,000 attacks every single day that are going on. And that's kind of profound that you think about it. That's a lot of attacks, and those are just the ones that are succeeding in a lot of ways. As a matter of fact, there's a survey from KnowBe4 that I helped them. I wrote the survey and the survey report for them on this, and found out that on the average, 33% of organizations, you can see it up there on the slides, that they've experienced a ransomware attack in the last 12 months. Now, those numbers get a little worse. For a couple of different company sizes. Like, for example, as you got smaller and smaller in organizations, which kind of aligns with having less and less technology in place to protect you. But as you get down to, let's say, even the 1 to 50 employee range, that number jumped up to 82%. So it has a lot to do with not just the size of the organization, but the amount of resources being put at this problem. And then in particular, the technology industry, healthcare, manufacturing, those are the largest spaces that had the hardest hit, is probably the best way to put it. And then the other thing here is when I look at the average impact, this also kind of comes from that KnowBe4 report here. There's a couple of good tidbits of information in terms of how much did it impact from a single attack. You might think in a lot of cases that a ransomware attack is simply a single machine kind of problem. One person gets infected and that's it. That's actually not the case. There's a lot of examples I'll try to come up with here a little bit, and I'll share in a moment here. But the average impact is, you see here, 6 different workstations and 2 servers. On the average, it's the average. So it doesn't mean that if you're a smart person, you know what average means. Everybody does. But if you're trying to figure it out, going, that means on the high end it's 12 endpoints and 4 servers. No, it's not exactly that. It's just we did an average of both endpoints and servers and came up with the answer was roughly the average of being about this much. And so it wasn't just impacting one machine or one endpoint. It's a number of endpoints, and it's connecting out to servers as well on the average anyways. And then the impact to you guys in IT is, you can see here, 12 hours of downtime for both users and for IT, meaning users had to 12 hours of not being able to use the machine, and it took IT, coincidentally it's the same amount, but on the average around 12 hours to fix the problem. And so this is some really nasty stuff these days. It isn't just as simple as sort of like, I think of like my dad and my mom, and they've had a lot of malware hit their machines because they go to these different sites or whatever on the web, and they just okay, I'll click yes and okay, and they'll just let things hit hit their machine, and we think it's just some kind of simple sort of novice piece of malware. This is very sophisticated stuff. I mean, there's 3 I want to mention, actually 4 I want to mention that are of late that have come into the news. One is called SAMIS. And SAMIS is actually a really nasty variant that they think it's actually deleting Veeam virtual backups as part of the process of then also encrypting all the files. That way you can't recover at all. And I mean, they're really getting kind of nasty. Another one example is one called Cerber. And Cerber is a nasty variant that actually tries to evade machine learning file detection by the way that it's been kind of described is it hollows out a process that exists and sort of emulates that and obfuscates itself by looking like a regular process on the machine. One of the good news is that it has a weakness. It does DLL unpacking as part of its delivery, and so that ends up usually raising a flag of some kind with any kind of protective solution. Another one's called Petya. Petya is actually really nasty because it doesn't encrypt files, it encrypts your master file table. So it gets all of your files. Because you can't get your master file table, your entire drive is useless. So that's kind of really, really nasty there as well. And then there's another variant that I think is very interesting that kind of paints a picture of how much this is a business and how people are behind this, and people are trying to think of new ways, and innovating, just like the good guys, people like at Veriato that are trying to innovate new ways to help thwart bad guys. Bad guys are trying to innovate in order to make money off of your organization. There's one called Popcorn Time. It came out at the end of last year. And Popcorn Time is sort of unique in that what it does is it encrypts someone's machine, and then it says, I'll give you a key to decrypt this for free. For free. It wouldn't cost you anything if you'll help me infect 2 other people. Think about that. I mean, now it's like collusion, man. This is like getting ridiculous. But that's if you think about it from a monetization standpoint, that's brilliant. Yeah. Why would you want one person paying off the ransom when you can get 2. And it's like that old, if I don't know how old you guys are in the audience, I'm in my 40s. If you go way back to, I don't know, probably in the 80s or something, there was that shampoo commercial where, I forget what it was for, maybe one of you guys can put it in the Q&A box, one of those shampoos where it says, I told 2 friends, and they told 2 friends, and so on, and so on. It was basically about how everyone loved this shampoo so much. It's kind of like that with popcorn time, because they infected you, they're going to infect 2 other people if you let them, and then those 2 people, they'll offer the same thing. Hey, I'll let you guys get off the hook if you infect 2 other people themselves, and and that kind of thing. So it kind of exponentially grows. It gets really, really nasty. So it's not a great place for us to be right now. We've got to come up with a layered defense around here in order to protect ourselves. And there's sort of 5 steps that I've come up with here. And these were in the abstract, so these shouldn't come as any surprise, but just to kind of walk through them real quick. You've got preparation. That's basically before the ransomware ever attacks, before it ever even hits your organization. But there are some things that we're going to look at what you should be doing today before it ever even becomes a reality in your organization. Should it become a realization, there's an aspect to detecting that it exists, that it's made its way into your organization. We've got to figure that out. And then how to contain it and eradicate it. I think those are somewhat self-explanatory. We don't want a piece of ransomware trying to laterally move within your organization. You want to contain it and, of course, get rid of it. And then how do you recover from that, whether it's an endpoint or a server. We're going to talk about this. Now, what's interesting is as I look at sort of the timeline that exists of a ransomware attack, and sort of before the ransomware attack and even after the ransomware attack, a little bit before, just the entire duration of time that ransomware, where you're concerned about it when it hits your organization. It starts, of course, with some kind of means of having the ransomware, the malware getting in. And that could be an email. Phishing attacks are still one of the #1 ways of getting malware into an organization today. Could be a maliciously, malware-loaded website of some kind. That sort of thing as well, where malicious links are clicked and then it redirects you, or it downloads based off of knowing that you have some kind of vulnerability. It could be in Flash or Java or whatever the case is. But I'm just using the email here to represent there's some delivery mechanism. You, of course, have the actual delivery of some kind of piece of malware. Usually it's a Trojan of some kind. A couple of them that come to mind would be things like BetaBot, or there's Covter. There's a bunch of other ones that are being used today, but those are some of the ones that have kind of come in the news in the last year or so. And you have some kind of Trojan that's in there that gets access to the machine, grabs itself, grabs persistence, and then does sort of a command and control, goes back to somewhere and gets a payload, brings it down, and loads up the ransomware. And then you've got, of course, it's gained access to a workstation, and it either encrypts the entire workstation, encrypts the files. L'Oreal Hell Color. Thank you, Robin. Robin, remember this? L'Oreal was the shampoo that you tell 2 friends and 2 friends and so on and so on. Thank you, Robin. So the malware the ransomware either encrypts a given workstation, could be all of it, like the example of the master file tables with Petya, or it could be a folder all at once. In a lot of cases, it's even just individual files. That's one of the ways that business of ransomware has evolved over the last about 2 years, where it used to be always, we're going to get an entire folder or an entire drive, and you have to pay me, let's say, $100 to unlock all of it. I'm making up numbers here, but in concept, you get where I'm going. Instead, they've chosen, let me encrypt each file separately, and you can pay me, just as a point of reference, $1 per file. Which ones do you want? Think about that. Now we've not only, we really effectively, they've multiplied their revenue stream, because it's not $100 to get everything. It's either which 100 files do you want, or if you want 200 files, cool, I'll take $200 from you. That's kind of the mindset. But then also these pieces of ransomware are smart enough to go out to servers. We'll look for SMB connections on Windows machines. We'll connect across those SMB connections, and then we'll begin to encrypt files on those servers as well. So that's why back to that KnowBe4 survey, where it was 6 endpoints and 2 servers, why that's the average. It's because you've got the variants of ransomware that are actually going out all the way to servers and not just encrypting the one endpoint that they gain access to. So there are, within this concept here, there's a couple of spots where these 5 steps, I forgot the last part here, pardon me, it's recovery. And the last part is whether it's the workstation or the server that gets encrypted, or both, you have this need for recovery. Recovery might come in the form of either paying the ransom, which we'll talk about later on, or you're going to have to recover by using backups of workstations or servers, as the case might be. And in all of these, there are 5 places where these 5 steps fit in. You have preparation sort of before the ransomware email, the delivery mechanism even occurs. You've got detection. Detection can happen at the email, when they browse the web. It could be detection of when the Trojan tries to load. So right in that spot. Then you've got the containment and eradication that's going to happen on the workstations or servers when the ransomware is successfully encrypting, I was going to say eradicate again, encrypting those files. And then the last part there is recovery. So these 5 steps kind of fit within this timeline quite neatly here. And so what I'm going to do to kind of simplify the conversation is I'm going to break up the 5 steps that you've got to take into kind of 3 slides I want to cover. And the 3 slides are roughly are before, during, and after. And so what they mean is, the things you should do before the ransomware ever hits, the things you do during when it does actually hit, and then what you're going to do after the fact. After the whole thing is over with, how do you recover and put yourself back up to an operational state? So let's talk about, by starting with, I guess, before the threat's a good place to start, of course. And as I think about the steps you need to take before the threat, the first thing I want to look at is sort of what is the strategy here. And there's sort of a twofold strategy of what you're trying to accomplish before the threat ever occurs, before the ransomware ever even hits your organization, before someone clicks the link, before someone opens the phishing email. And that is, of course, you're trying to prevent infection in the first place. You want to figure out what are the ways I can keep that from ever getting in, ever. And then at the same time, you want to figure out ways to limit the exposure and the impact should it get in. Now, this is a very interesting kind of way to look at this, because this is all sort of supposed to be preparation, where you're trying to protect yourself so that it never ever happens. And yet I just said, let's limit the exposure and the impact, sort of sheepishly sort of said, like, just in case it gets in. And the reason is, back to some of the survey data that I've looked at over the years, organizations that have, let's say, one solution, they're more prone to having ransomware still get into the organization. Even if you have a layered approach, there's still the possibility. And so I think that the best way to do this is to take this kind of like how you do car insurance, right? You buy car insurance, even though you're hoping it never happens, but just in case it does, you're thinking, well, I better get some car insurance, just so that I'm protected. And that kind of thing. And it's sort of that same model. So part of this is definitely proactive. It is not going to happen. It's things like, I'm going to go get oil changes on my car so that something bad never happens. But then you also have the warranty, and that's sort of what the second one's about. It's sort of like, let me have a protection just in case something really awful really happens. So the question becomes, how do you prepare? And I've got 5 things in here and how we're going to prepare, and they kind of fit within both the sort of preparation. I guess really just sticks with preparation for now, a little bit of the detection, but it'll be used for detection later on. And the first one is by thinking about the prevention of infection in the first place. And you want to have, and I'm going to mention this again, it's a layered approach. This is defense in depth. This is like castle walls and a moat, and pouring the tar over the sides, and we have the guys ready with the crossbows, and if somebody happens to break through the wall, we have another defensive place inside of that where we retreat to that as well, and it's got its own, this is a layered defense. And so you see the first one up here kind of makes sense already. You want to have something in place that is going to be looking for malware. Could be signature-based, heuristics-based, activity or behavior-based. You have email, URL protection, URL scanning, domain, I'm losing my mind here, where they're giving a score to the domains, and I can't think of the term, and you guys know what I'm talking about, but I can't think of it. But anyways, we're trying to protect against all of those different aspects of how the different malware is going to come in, how this ransomware is going to get in, the Trojans are going to get in, and it's through some very specific avenues, and it's email and it's surfing the web for the most part. So it's looking for phishing protection, looking at the domains that are used, whether it's kind of even the kind of messaging that's being used inside email, and again, this the whole thing kind of wraps together to put a layered approach in place that protects you against it ever infecting you in the first place. Now, the other ones that I've got here, some of them kind of tie into both of these. Some of these fall into just limiting of exposure. But this first one is really about prevention of infection. We want to stop the malware from coming, maybe with an antivirus solution. We want to stop email phishing by maybe having an email scanning type solution. We want to protect against any kind of looking at URLs, looking at the domain reputation. That's what I was thinking of. I couldn't think of what that was. You said fingerprinting, Beatriz. I was thinking of domain reputation, but close enough. I'll take it. And so the idea is to kind of plug in those gaps and make sure that the ransomware can't get in that way, or the Trojans that are going to download the payloads of ransomware. So then we've got endpoint protection. Again, if we assume that something is going to get in, we're going to make that assumption, going to have the warranty. The endpoint protection is about having something where you essentially have whitelist blacklisting of your applications. You can do this yourself just with group policies in Windows. It's possible, but it's not very flexible. It isn't dynamic. It's a static list. It's easy to thwart. It's just looking at executable names, things like that. So this is a little more in-depth endpoint protection. Endpoint protection solutions typically are going to stop a process from running because it's not something that's approved. So that also includes, like, you can't run the Dropbox sync app because it got blocked, but that way also you know that ransomware isn't going to run either. So that's another thing to look at there. You also should look at, again, kind of going down the path here, in case it does happen to get onto a machine, does happen to run, it gets past the malware email URL protection, past the endpoint protection, is think about implementing least privilege. And least privilege starts with things just like, let's say for you guys in IT, you don't log onto your own workstation with a privileged account. You log on to a separate account. And you log in with a low-level user account to do your emails and your Word and your Excel and whatever else, and then you log on, you know, with a different set of credentials. But if you want to take that a step even further than that, it's things like secured workstations, where you have two different workstations. If you really want to be super secure, and you think like we have one, we actually have a non-elevated account, a low-level user account for your normal stuff like email and all that, and you have a separate machine that's hardened, doesn't have internet access, things like that to do your actual IT management. Seems a little ridiculous, but it is something that you can go to. Another variant of that is utilizing a physical machine for your elevated privileges, and then you use a VM inside of that privileged machine that has no access to the host machine, and that's the machine that you run your low-level user stuff. Seems a little weird and counterintuitive, but it's the right way to do it, because if your low-level user stuff goes out and you click on an email and it has a phishing email on a phishing attachment of some kind that tries to load a Trojan and blah, 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 all this stuff, it's stuck inside of a VM. All you do is revert. But your physical machine that is for your elevated privileges, that machine is actually hardened, has no internet access itself, things like that, and that's why you would do it that way. So least privilege can go from, you know, some small steps to something far more drastic, and I haven't even gone through everything you possibly could do in least privilege alone, but there's a lot more that you can do. Another good step here is looking at user training and phishing testing. And in this case, this is about organizations that, like KnowBe4 is a good example. They're the ones that did that survey that I helped them write a couple months ago. But what they'll do is they will have a platform in-house that you both do user training, you teach people about phishing scams, how to spot a phishing email, things like that, and they do phishing testing as well. It's a great way to make sure you limit exposure. And then the last one here is backups, and in this case, this is like kind of the end, just in case everything goes to pot and the malware was completely successful, got past malware detection, you got past the endpoint protection, we're protecting from processes running, or something that's going to detect malware, ransomware from running and stop it in its tracks, or those kinds of solutions. Least privilege didn't help. It was able to encrypt a whole bunch of files anyways, and obviously the training didn't work because it got in. As a last step effort, you have at least backups in place, and you need to be thinking about which endpoints. This is what you do before the threat. You think about which endpoints, servers, workstations need to be protected, which data sets need to be protected from a ransomware attack, and then make sure that you have appropriate backups of those so that you can recover them easily. Because this becomes partially about you getting the user operational again, but also it's about you limiting the amount of time IT has to invest in recovery should it happen. Right? So servers are kind of easy. Let's take images of servers, as the case might be. But then workstations, what do you do? Some of you have very different kinds of kind of approaches to that, whether you're going to do even backups at all of endpoints, whether they're virtual, whether you're doing image-based, you know, just backing up some critical files, that sort of thing. It really just kind of depends. Now, then there's the next step is kind of during the attack. Now, before I talk about during the attack itself, I want to ask you guys a couple of questions here just to kind of tailor the conversation a little bit. And I'm going to put 2 poll questions up here for you. and just to kind of get a sense of where you're at. The first one here is really simple. It's just simply, have you experienced a ransomware attack in the last 12 months? This is totally anonymous. No one's going to say such a company had it, but just have you had one? Go ahead and interact with the screen. Type that in there. I'm going to guess that something like between a third and a half of you are going to say yes. That's my guess. But go ahead and just interact with the screen and put there if you've experienced a ransomware attack or not. Pretty simple here, so I'll wait about 10 more seconds or so. It looks like half of you have voted already. And I'll wait just another second or two or three because they're still coming in. You guys are clickety-clicketing, and I like that. And I will go ahead, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll, and I'll share the results out. You can see here, that's about right, about almost a third. Almost a third of you has said yes, you've experienced it. So going back to my opening statement when I mentioned some of you are in that boat, and a lot of you are more in the I never want it to happen, what am I supposed to do? And either way, you guys are on the right call. We can at least have this conversation together. So only about 30% of you have actually experienced it in the last 12 months. So then the next one I've got, just to kind of get a sense here, is how many solutions do you have in place? And this is just to look at what you're doing today to figure out, do you have one? Do you have sort of more than one? Like I put 2 to 5 and I have more than 5? And I know it seems ludicrous for more than 5, but this is specifically about ransomware. So I'm thinking you have antivirus, you may have an application firewall of some kind, you might have something that actually scans network traffic. I mean, there's a lot of different kinds of solutions. So go ahead and interact with those. I'm going to assume that most of you are somewhere in the 2 to 5 category. That's the broadest one anyways that I've got as an answer there. But it kind of fits the mold here because most organizations don't just have one, but I thought I at least would ask to see where you guys are at. And that helps me kind of tailor the presentation a little bit the rest of the way as we're talking about during and then after an attack. And it looks like I've got about 60% of you have voted, and I'm going to wait another couple of seconds here because it looks like they're still coming in. And I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. Thank you guys. Appreciate that 63% of you did that. The results here, kind of no surprise to me, but just so you can see here, almost 20% of you won. Most of you are in the 2 to 5 category. And then more than 5, obviously 11%. So what I find interesting is for some of you that were thinking more than 5 is sort of a strange answer, like who has 5 solutions, who has 7 solutions? You can see there's 11% of people here that actually do have a lot of different solutions in place. It could be even on the endpoint. You can think about having antivirus. You could think about having a separate anti-malware solution. You could have something that's endpoint protection. Then you've got something that's watching your emails and scanning your emails. You got another solution maybe like built into your antivirus. That's another platform that's doing sort of the URL scanning and domain validation, things like that. So it's not too far off the cuff to say more than 5 solutions. So let me hide those results, and let me go ahead and show back out my my PowerPoint here. I think I have to start the presentation and then show the screen here, wherever it is. Come on down here. There we go. PowerPoint. And you guys should see the during an attack up there on the screen. And so the first step in during an attack, there again, like there's a strategy for preparation during an attack. You have twofold goals here. I put identify and isolate. You want to know that it's happening, and you want an ability to keep it from happening elsewhere. Popcorn time is sort of an outlier of how it's going to spread. In a lot of cases, there's malware gets very, very nasty these days where they're trying to automate as much as they can. There's a playbook now. I mean, I don't mean a physical playbook. You can go on a web, but there's like a yes. Go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt you. You're back to the first slide.
Let's try this right here. Do you see it now?
Yes, there we go.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Kurt. Appreciate it. And so there's a playbook that these attackers are using, and they're trying to automate this as much as possible. And part of that playbook, normally for any kind of malware, includes horizontally expanding through your organization. They want lateral movement of some kind to get to other machines. And they'll leverage things like trying to identify what credentials you have. There's tools like Mimikatz as an example. You can go into a Windows machine, you can see what credentials, just raw passwords that are unencrypted. You got password hashes that you can use to hash the hash attack. You got Kerberos tickets that can try to be broken. And so what they're doing now, in fact, there's an entire scripting kit that exists where all of that can be scripted and automated. So you have to isolate as part of this goal. It's not just to figure out when it hits, it's to make sure that it stops. And so there's 2 ways here as I think about this. to be thinking about the attack, you got to think about the infection, like which machines are being impacted here, and then also what data is being impacted. So it's a kind of a two-factor issue here that you've got to be considering what you're going to do. Now, in the case of infection, there's a couple ways to do this. One is you could be monitoring, like there's actually some of these things you can do right out of the box with Windows, where you can be monitoring for specific processes that start. There's a bunch of new logging in Windows 10 that came up. Even back in Windows 7, there was some new stuff there as well, but started Windows 10 as well, where you can get some very deep process level logging that can go on. That, of course, has to be centrally correlated together through some kind of event log solution or whatever the case is. But there are ways to do that in order to identify if certain processes, or maybe if a process is trying to start another process and it looks out of the ordinary. So there are ways to detect that even out of the box in kind of a DIY fashion. But typically, it's going to be something more along the lines of if you have endpoint protection in place, or something like that, where it's watching to see if a machine tries to become infected. It shouldn't in concept, but if for some reason it did, at least you have something that's monitoring all the processes that are running. But it really comes down to that. You're watching that infection. And the impacted data is a little tougher. You're obviously going to figure that out because the ransomware folks are going to tell you, hey, I encrypted this stuff over here, pay me a bazillion rubles, right? And or Bitcoin, I guess, would be the right unit of measure there. And so it's not like you're going to have to go figuring out what data is impacted. They're going to tell you, without any uncertainty here. So what you've got to do is you've got to, of course, figure out, define, and isolate the machines. And I kind of put a couple notes in here that I'm thinking about. And the first thing here is monitoring your workstations. It could be your monitoring processes, especially ones that are more critical, that have access to critical data. I think in a lot of ways, you want to approach this sort of from a role-centric view, where I think about an individual user and what access they have, and do I want the stuff that they have access to be encrypted. Remember that if a piece of ransomware can encrypt some files, it can also exfiltrate. And I don't see that happening today very much, but it is entirely possible. That bothers me. It should bother you. So I'd be at least monitoring those machines, watching their processes, seeing if there's something that looks out of the norm, and so on, as well as root cause analysis. A lot of the endpoint protection solutions will include an ability to kind of show where the same process has popped its head up everywhere in the organization, so you can kind of figure out where it started. It might have started from an email, which, by the way, Popcorn Time, that's one of the ways they do it. They say, here's a link, go send this email to 3 people and tell them whatever, and you end up getting root cause analysis that way. And then you also want to look at doing machine and process quarantining. There's some great tools that exist. As an example, VMware's NSX, fantastic software-defined networking. It's a virtualization layer, and what it does, it has a lot of APIs that are opened up to allow third-party vendors to hook into it. And so, for example, let's say you had an antivirus solution that found that there was a rogue process of some kind. It talks to NSX and says, I found something, isolate this machine, goes to the virtual firewall, closes the machine off from the rest of the network, and then that way the antivirus can do whatever it needs to do to try and clean up the machine. And when it's cleaned up the machine successfully, it tells NSX, okay, I cleaned the machine up, go ahead and let it back on the network. Things like that. There's some cool stuff you can do. It involves solutions. In this case, if you're going to do it yourself, there's not a lot of you can do around quarantining other than yanking the cable, as the case might be. But you kind of want to think about it that way. It might be really you're going to have to look at having a solution that's going to try and you focus more on the proactive, let me see if I can stop it from ever happening, more so than something where you're going to try and process quarantine or machine quarantine after the fact. It's not going to be something you can easily do on your own. All right, so looking at the aftermath, after the attack itself, just kind of addressing that, I've got, again, as with the other ones, there's a strategy involved, and the strategy here is to be as operational as you were before the attack. It's also, let me get rid of the ransomware. That's pretty simple. It's either a question of, whether you're going to pay or not to pay. And that seems to be a big question, and I've heard both sides of the coin, so I'm not going to tell you the answer is. I'm going to provide you both sides of the coin. So it used to be, roll the clock back, let's say 3 or 4 years ago, when ransomware was a little less of a business and more of people going and getting like ransomware as a service or malware as a service off the web and kind of coming up with their own iteration and trying to put it out there to see if they can make a buck. The answer used to be don't pay. And the reason for it was there was no guarantee that they actually have the decryption key. But as the business of ransomware has evolved, and I'm using those words on purpose, as that business has evolved, it's in their best interests to pay the ransom, because if it happens again and they can get into your same organization, you might just go, just pay the ransom. It's $200. It costs us more to fix the problem than to pay for the decryption. So just pay it. And so in some cases, the general consensus is to pay. But you'll still hear people saying, don't pay the ransom. If you can recover yourself, for off of your tape and off of your backups and that sort of thing, cool. Maybe using image-based machines, you have VDI, that sort of thing. You just roll back to an earlier snapshot. Cool. That's good. Then you don't have to pay. And I think that becomes really where the answer is. To pay or not to pay is a question of, can you easily recover faster and more cost effectively than paying the ransom itself. This is not a case of, if you pay, the terrorists win. It's not like that. It's a business. It sucks, but it's a business kind of a transaction where, which is going to cost your company less? Is it the $150 they're asking for, or the 9 hours of IT time trying to fix the machine? It might just be cheaper to pay the ransom and be done with it. So kind of got to think about that. I'm not telling you to pay the ransom. I'm just saying, kind of think about that yourself. Then you have the issue of trying to eradicate the instances of ransomware. Again, 6 machines, 2 servers on the average. This is not, I don't trust, as an IT professional, I don't trust the concept of, let me just use like a tool that's going to wipe it out. I just don't feel good about that. You might be going, it's fine. If Symantec, McAfee, Kaspersky, insert whatever AV vendor name here, if they say it's gone and you go, I'm good with that, cool, then that's fine. Personally, I'm not. Just me. To me, I'm going, nah, if it had a ransomware on it, I want to wipe that machine and start over. And that becomes part of maybe the planning. If we're really thinking about ransomware, what are we going to do? Maybe you have a machine image and you have some kind of desktop management solution or something that does desktop configurations or personalization, and it pushes that down, and you go, cool, we can just blow the machine away, put an image in, and it'll install Office and everything else, and we're happy. Then great. Then that's your answer to how you're going to eradicate. Some of you might be just fine with antivirus, anti-malware, just eliminating it itself. That's fine too. Just like I said, my personal stance is I don't like that. It bothers me a little bit too much. And then there's that issue of just recovering all data. In case you, let's say, don't pay the ransom and you have a server that's affected, it's a file server, and they've gone through every single folder that the particular user could gain access to through the SMB share that they connected to. It might be that that's really critical data and you're trying to figure out how to recover that. And part of me also goes along those same lines of going, if I pay the ransom and they decrypt it, is it really good? I don't know. How good is their encryption and decryption? From a data integrity standpoint, how good is it? I don't know. So I would probably hope that you'd have backups, and I would probably recommend you recover anyways. And it sounds like a lot of work, I know, but that's all the more reason why you've got to be as proactive as you can with as much of a layered defense as you possibly can have, is the way I'm thinking about this. And then the last part here is you learn the lessons. What happened? How did it transpire? How did it come in? That's probably the big thing, is more like the root cause analysis and figuring out how did it get in there in the first place and what can you do differently. So if it was a phishing email and you didn't have any phishing training and testing, maybe you go, we probably need to have that in place. And and evolve, because the ransomware folks are evolving. Every day they're working, getting up every day to make their product better. Meaning it's going to get in more easily and be more pervasive throughout the organization and so on. So you've got to make sure that your defenses are better in the same way. All right, so let me do this. I'm going to kind of sum this up. I've got a couple of slides here to talk to you about the sponsor, Veriato, here, and then we've got, I think, a couple of questions that have come in here, and we'll take those at the end here. So protecting against ransomware, I think you guys have to really think about this as being something that's inevitable. It's not a when, excuse me, it's not an if, it's a when, right? That's how you have to think about this. If 33% of organizations, no matter what defenses they had in place, still had a ransomware attack in the last 12 months, that's a pretty material percentage of you guys. I mean, there's 170 of you on the call, so call that 65 of you definitely are going to have it. And we saw that even on the stats. 30% of you said you had it. So it kind of aligns there. You can see that this lends itself a lot towards preparation, because the aftermath portion is really kind of not pretty. it's a lot of work that you somewhat know what you have to do, and it leans back to I've really got to have a very strong preparation, and you've got to think about the plan for all three parts, the before, the during, and the after, all 5 of those steps, so that way you have a proper protection for ransomware. So you're thinking about in the preparation, what is it I'm going to do beforehand? I'm going to make sure that I have the right solutions in place to protect ourselves so it never happens. If it does happen, I can detect it, I can contain it, I can eradicate it, and then if I have to, I can recover. You think about it that way. And then even with all of this, because there's that aspect of this where it's kind of a, hey, even with the multiple solutions, a whole material percentage of organizations are still getting hit. I have this up here. So you might not win the war, right? You're not going to absolutely keep it from ever happening, but you'll minimize the number of battles and you'll minimize the impact of those battles and the casualties therein. So, so just very quickly here, a couple of slides here. The webinar was brought to you by Veriato Ransom Safe. To give you a little bit of information on it real quickly here. This is actually a vital layer in the defense. It's a very cool product, by the way. What it does is it watches on the servers, it kind of creates a honeypot. And the moment that a piece of ransomware tries to attract and encrypt the honeypot, rather, it detects that that's happening and it shuts it down. Very, very cool technology. Unlike most organizations where they'll say they have a piece of software that will detect ransomware, but they're thinking about it from like a heuristics or a behavior, or they're looking at it like from a signature base, something like that, where they're looking at it from kind of the, what is it that's running, and I can tell that that thing is running is ransomware. This is more of a really watching what it does kind of product. And you can kind of see here, basically, if ransomware reaches a file server, it detects that, again, with this honeypot set of files and folders, that it makes sure that are always first. And those are the ones that the ransomware tries to attack, and it goes, yeah, I know that's ransomware, and it goes ahead and it shuts down that before it ever actually wreaks any havoc on your data. You can see here that it backs up the files before they're changed. That way, if it does happen to reach some files outside that honeypot, those are backed up first, and that way they can be easily recovered. And then the rapid recovery occurs there to make sure that if there's as minimal disruption as is possible. So I'm going to leave this slide up here as sort of a thanks for attending the webinar. The folks at Veriato have included here a promo code for 10% off a ransom safe through April 14th. You can obviously find more information at that URL there. And while I leave this up here, Holger, I'm going to hand things back to you for some Q&A. I saw a couple of questions in there. Looks like we've got some good ones in there. So take it away, Holger.
Awesome. Thank you, Nick. That was excellent, by the way. Now, let's take a look. There's a couple of live questions coming in. And as a quick reminder for our webinar audience, you can still submit questions through your GoToWebinar control panel. So as we go and start the Q&A session, please, by all means, feel free and add your question. Now, the first one that I'd like to pick is about budget. The question is, we got a limited budget, and you said that ransomware is, going to get into the organization anyway. So where should I put my efforts? Nick?
That's a good question, because I'm gonna kind of paraphrase this. I only have so many dollars, and where should I spend it? And I think the answer here is it's real tough. I guess I'm going to look at it this way. You guys in the audience have your own way of kind of approaching problems like this, where you know that it might happen, and so you're either going to go, I'm going to try and minimize it from ever happening. Back to my example of the car. You're going to go, I'm going to get my oil changes on my belts, and I'm going to check, and I'm going to take it in for the 10, the 25, the 75,000 mile inspections. I'm going to try to be as proactive as I can, and that's the way that you spend your dollars on your car. And others of you are like, I'm just going to get a warranty and a maintenance plan, and when the car is a problem, I just take it in and I don't care about it, right? We all have the same kind of approaches when it comes to IT. So I'm gonna kind of pick out two things. One is, if you're going to be as proactive as you can, I would probably start at the source. The reason that ransomware comes in is because users click on things. So I would probably spend the dollars on training, because you guys you've had these things come in. You've seen them yourself. So have I. I got an email one day from PayPal, and it said from PayPal Inc., which is really weird because PayPal never does that. I was in tech marketing. I know that from a branding standpoint, you just put PayPal. That's the name, not PayPal Inc. And it was this thing about there was a problem with one of your transactions, and I just have happened to pay a couple contractors that day, and I'm like, huh? They kind of got me, at least got my attention, and it looks good. It really does. We've all seen these emails like that, and we're all able to fall, prey to those and be susceptible to some of those, those dastardly ways that they write those things. And so I think having good user training and testing the phishing to see if users are kind of on guard all the time, that's one of the best ways to spend money there. On the other end, if it's going to happen anyways and it's going to get in and run, then one could say endpoint protection, but then it wouldn't have run. And if it still runs anyways, and I've got people that have endpoint protection, if you look at the know before data, if you go back to that, you'll see people have endpoint protection in place, and they still had ransomware affect them. I'm not being paid to say this. I would probably go with something like this, with like RandomSafe, only because then at least I've got something that's going to actually stop it. That's what I want. I want something that's actually going to stop it, and I'm going to leave that to you guys to decide whether it's RandomSafe or it's an antivirus, an endpoint protection, another solution. But you're going to have to put your eggs in one of these baskets where you think you're going to get your best bet, whether it's the warranty or it's the proactive maintenance of your car. You got to kind of figure that out for yourself a little bit there. So I hope that answers your question.
Great answer. The next question is about email. If email is a key method of entry, isn't my email scanning solution enough? Nick?
So good question. Yes, but no. And the reason is it depends on what your email scanning solution does. There's a lot of variance just inside email scanning alone where they might be doing signature-based. I've mentioned some of these before, heuristics-based, behavior-based. These are kind of cool. Some even have virtual sandboxes, and they'll detonate the attachment. What I mean by that is they'll take the attachment, stick it in the sandbox, pretend to be an environment, as it kind of duplicate the double-clicking of it, if you will, and then see what happens to it. And see if it just opens up like a PDF, or if it's a Word doc that has a macro and it's, they're looking for macro to enable, because those are some real nasty variants where you've got a Word doc that has a macro, the macro actually then downloads a Trojan, the Trojan then downloads the payload, and the payload then loads up as ransomware. It's really a multi-step process. You've got things like that happen, and then there's even variants of email scanning where they use deception as their method of protection. And what I mean by that is they will actually, those types of solutions will see that there's maybe something in email scanning that will it'll look at an attachment, and when it detonates it, it says, I am not the right environment for you to run in, because a lot of what the ransomware and malware and Trojans that are running today, what they'll do is they will check. They'll do an environment check, and they'll say, what version of Chrome are you running, and do you have Java installed, and how about Flash, and what version is it? I'm not even kidding. It's like they're scoping things out to figure out what's the best way they can attack. And so they have solutions even that will do things like deceive and go, oh, I don't even have Java. I don't even have Flash either. In fact, I'm an old copy of DOS 3.2, or whatever it is it says, right? Just something where it's going, I don't know, I'm not even from here, and then the thing goes, forget it, I can't run. And so the answer when you ask, hey, my email solution is going to do it, that the scanning of it is going to protect me, I'm going to say yes and no. I don't know what you have. It really depends on how many different layers they're putting in that alone, and then it also depends on if it's even email. If they click a link somewhere that is on a website where it's malware laden because it's an old unprotected, it's an old version of WordPress or something that doesn't patched, and someone gains access to that, there's lots of ways this can happen. So it's nastiness. I don't think that's the right answer. Just one solution. You'd have a layered approach.
Perfect. Thank you, Nick. There are tons of questions coming in, so let's take those rapid fire. Next question is about backups. How do we ensure that the backup does not contain malware? That is, that the malware is not backed up. Nick?
That's a good question. I saw another question that said something similar. It was, how do we know how far to go back? And it's the same question. It's basically saying, how do we know when we got infected? And therein lies the problem. I don't have a good answer. I mean, I'm just to be open and honest. There isn't a good answer where you know how far to go back. I think that if instead one of the approach that I would take, because none of us know how far to go back, the approach I would probably take is going back to what I said earlier. I'd probably look at the roles and do a role-based assessment, and if there are people that are very critical to the organization and they're sort of high-risk individuals in terms of if their machines became compromised and the data they have access to, the intellectual property, it's going to cripple the organization, or at least cripple part of the profitability and productivity of the organization. I would probably look to, let's say, at least virtualize those machines and have multiple snapshots, something along those lines where, because you don't know, you can at least have some kinds of action other than to say, I don't know how far back we need to go. At least you've got some kind of answer there. I know it's not the best answer what you want to hear, but that's really the best answer one can come up with.
Yeah, it's probably the reality of it. Now, the next question is about signature-based detection. So are signature-based detection mechanism effective nowadays, right, as we're witnessing unknown or zero-day threats? And what would be the best plan for addressing those unknowns?
Okay, good question. So on a signature-based standpoint, just for answering kind of the first part of the question, which is, are they still viable? I forget exactly where they put it. Are they effective? I'm looking at the question here. I'm going to say yes and no. If it's an old variant, sure. I mean, right? It's signature-based. It's looking for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in the code, and look, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Sure. I mean, that it can be effective, but remember, this goes back to sort of I'm trying to elevate your thinking rather than saying go do exactly this. And here's what I'm trying to do to elevate your thinking. It's a business on the other end, and they're trying to make their product better every day. I've said that before. So let's apply the signature-based detection model to the problem. What are they doing today? They're going, crap, Symantec or whomever detects us based off of our signature. Great, let's figure out a way. How can we come up with a way that our signature can't be detected? Let's get a copy of Symantec and let's try a couple things. Let's get the programmers in the room. What are they going to do? They're going to build a better mousetrap. Well, not a better mousetrap, but basically a better cheese stealer, right? And try to figure out how to evade that. And there's actually variants now that keep changing how they look from a code standpoint, and the way that you thwart that. The other half of the question is, what's the best way to plan for this? Is to probably look at more behavior-based rather than signature-based, only because they at least act the same way, right? At the end of the day, they go out and they try and encrypt something. All your files. Master file table is a little bit of an outlier. That's a weird one. It doesn't act the same way, but all your files connecting across a server, and you can do behavior-based because you know what they want to do. So I think that's probably a better approach, is to look at something that's more behavior-based than signature-based. I hope that answers your question.
Very good. I really like the next one. It's about, payments for ransom, or ransom payments rather. Based on your experience, do you know what the average ransom payment is for the SMB marketplace?
Oh, actually, I do that. I know that. Hold on, because it's Attack. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for. Actually, I can leave that up for a minute. Let me just look. I'm going to find something. I'm going to answer. I do know that. I have it in Bitcoin. I can tell you that, but I have to look it up. So give me 2 seconds here while I bring this up, because I wrote this up, and it's in the Know Before report that I wrote for them. That's why I know that I have that detail. I just have to find it for you. Impact of the attack, blah, 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 or they pay the ransom, get the key. Okay, so the average is 5 Bitcoins, currently worth, at least the time that I wrote it, around $51.30 US. So, and most organizations pay 3 Bitcoins or less, so call it $3,000 to $5,000 was the average. And that wasn't for the SMB, because I know that's what you asked. I apologize, I don't have that answer specifically, but that was what we found in the survey that we did. So it's 3 to 5 Bitcoins.
Interesting data point. Now, the next question is about hardening, and what hardening requirements do you suggest in order to protect from ransomware? And then it says we follow CIS benchmark standards. Remember you touched on this earlier,
sure.
But maybe
okay. Perfect. So there's a company called Skyport Systems, and they have a product. They work with another company, Ascient something or other. I've done some work with those guys too, and they utilize Microsoft's 288 pages of recommendations for securing an Active Directory and a Windows environment. And so they're the experts on this more than I am, but some of the things that are done, when we're talking about hardening, are things like that separation of duties, right? If you heard me, I'm going to kind of repeat them a little bit, but things like having a separate workstation. You physically have two, you're sitting in your cube, you have 2 machines. Maybe you're swap between monitors, but it's 2 physical different machines. One is for your elevated access, and that has no internet access to it. It's just used, for accessing data on the your administrative tools and things like that. And then you've got a separate one that's for low-level user use and that kind of thing. And then if you think about it, for you guys in IT, for the most part, you guys don't need to access any data other than maybe some planning data and things like that. You could probably, for a low-level account, limit, really what you have access to in terms of if you need to access servers or file systems and like that. You could limit it down to like a shared folder that just you guys access, and that's it. And if you guys had that encrypted, you could just restore it. What do you care? But for other users, it's a little tougher, but they also don't necessarily have elevated privileges. So hardening comes down to, if you're really thinking about administrative from low-level user duty, it's things like not having access to the internet. It's having probably a lot more scrutiny put on those machines in terms of what processes can run. I'd probably have endpoint protection, watching for whitelisting and blacklisting of processes, things like that. And you have a lot more scrutiny on that. There's even a concept where this takes it to the far end for you guys, where you want to protect from any kind of malware. This is a little bit on a tangent, but I love this stuff. Protecting malware from ever gaining access to any of your elevated credentials in Active Directory, and it's called a red forest. And it's actually having a forest for your production, and that forest trusts an administrative forest that is where all the administrative accounts lie in, and you have to log into that from only a secured machine that has no access to anything else on the network except for that secured forest, and that's how you can manage everything. It's really, really nuts, and it seems like a lot of work, but if you're like really hardcore security and your environment requires it, that's taking things to an extreme level, but in a positive way, not in a negative way. But I mean, it's just, there's a lot you can do. But like I said, Microsoft has 288 pages of recommendations of things you can do in Active Directory, to Windows endpoints, to domain controllers. Oh boy, I could do an entire webinar on just that alone, on the things you could do to secure those down to like not allowing access to group policies, because you could end up giving user permissions that give them access to a domain controller, which then gives them access to all of Active Directory, which then gives them access to everything. I mean, it gets really crazy what these guys will do on the malware side in order to gain access to your network. So that was a very convoluted, many tangential, multifaceted answer, but I hope that you got some kind of wisdom out of that.
Awesome, I like it. That's great advice. Now, let's do one more question, and then I think we're at the finish line for the day. And the question is there a possibility to get ransomware on a host if the virtual machine is infected? I think that ties back to your example a few minutes ago. Nick?
Oh boy, let me say it this way. I'm going to say no, but anything is possible, because I can think of a way to do it, but it's a really long-winded way of doing it. So let's take a VMware environment for the sake of argument. It could be Hyper-V, it doesn't matter. Hyper-V is fine too. In theory, if someone was to log into a guest OS, but could somehow find their way to gain access to an account that had rights to manage the VMware environment, there's a very long-winded way of doing this. Too long for this webinar, but in theory, yeah, it's possible. It could, but I mean, it's not like ransomware is designed to just download the payload, find some files, encrypt them, put a thing on the screen saying "pay me." From that standpoint, I go, no, it's not possible, because that's what the thing's designed to do. But I could see it in the future where these malware authors at some point go, you know what, let's merge our thinking here, and let's figure out how much we can automate to find all the elevated accounts we can, and let's make it, like the ultimate devastating ransomware. We're going to lock the whole damn thing down. It's theoretically possible, so I'm going to say yes, but I just think it's not probable.
Thank you, Nick. And on that scary note, I think we're at the finish line for today's webinar.
Yeah, boom.
And there are more Q&A questions. We'll follow up on those. And unfortunately, we didn't get to, didn't have enough time to get to all of you today, to all of your questions. And you will also receive a follow-up email with links to the webinar recording and additional materials. And many thanks again, Nick, to you for sharing your unique insights and advice, right, regarding the ransomware threat and how to stop ransomware in its tracks. Also, many thanks to Veriato for hosting today's webinar. And this concludes today's webinar. I hope we will see you again at one of our future webinars. Thanks, everyone.